and welcome to the Weekly Sceptic, episode 71. I'm Nick Dixon here with Ron DeSantis fan Toby Young. And coming up, Trump wins big in Iowa, the Tories lose big in Lord Frost's new poll, and has Gary Lineker tweeted off more than he can chew, or X-posted off, as we have to say now, plus loads more, and of course, peak woke. But Toby, how is your dry January going?
Yeah, it's going okay, Nick. I have to confess, I have fallen off the wagon now twice, which isn't very impressive.
You've already fallen off the wagon twice. I'm doing it just in sympathy, and I haven't fallen off the wagon once. No, I'm doing it for myself, but yeah, I'm thinking I might not even ever drink again. Twice. What date is it? The 16th. This is the 16th.
I went out last Monday, and I was at a lunch actually, and there was someone at the lunch who was very insistent that I drink, and I was too weak-willed to resist the kind of extraordinary pressure this person was exerting on me. So I decided I would just to keep him happy, just have one drink, and of course then I immediately thought, oh well, that's it. I've broken my vow, so now I might as well just go all in. I didn't get drunk, but when I got home, Caroline said, "Have you been drinking? You seem a little altered." And so I had to confess, and she was, not angry but disappointed. But I did actually.
That was the first one.
So that was the first one, and then later in the week, I was at another. And actually, I'm getting because I've been drinking so much, I'm getting the timelines mixed up. But no, sorry, that was that was on the Friday before last, and then on the on Monday last. Oh, is that right? Oh God! No, sorry, that
we don't
was
need the
Monday.
exact days. The point is, you're drinking all the time, day after day. You're getting.
I drank twice. I can't now remember but I drank twice last week, which was pretty shocking.
It's all a blur.
But I'm now back on the wagon, and I was supposed to go to an event tonight after this podcast, but I've cancelled that in part because I'm not sure I have the willpower not to drink at that event. I find it very hard to go out and not drink, so my policy now is just to stay in for the rest of January. But I did speak to a guy called Tony Edwards, author of a book called The Very Good News About Wine, who is a contributor to the Daily Sceptic, to ask him what the optimal amount is. So he's rather unusual in that he's a medical journalist and has done a really deep dive into all the scientific literature around whether alcohol really is bad for you and what the optimal amount to drink is each week. We've communicated about this, and he's told me that a third of a bottle of red wine every night is better for you than drinking nothing. And even if you go up to 2/3 of a bottle, the benefits probably outweigh the costs. It's only if you go above that, the costs probably outweigh the benefits. So I took great reassurance from that. And actually, my mistake, Nick, has been in not drinking regularly during the month of January, rather than not drinking on most days and then falling off the wagon on a couple of them. So my plan from the beginning of February, following Tony Edwards' advice, is to drink no more than half a bottle of red wine when I do drink. And I'll allow myself to do that 4 times a week and try and limit myself to 100 bottles over the course of the year. And I hope, have built up some credit over the month of January by staying at home and not drinking for the rest of January.
Yeah, it's better for you if you stick to that. I mean, that's always a big if, isn't it? But who are these people who can just stick to that? Much easier to go cold turkey, like I do.
Well, I wrote about it in The Spectator and asked for readers' advice about how to stick to my 100 bottle a year limit. And one bit of advice, which I thought was quite good, was that after you've had your half bottle of wine each night, assuming you're at home, you then have a milky cup of tea or go and brush your teeth. So you know that the next glass is not going to taste right. It's going to taste horrible. And in that way, even if you feel a little bit weak-willed, you rush off and drink the milky tea or brush your teeth. And then that really kills the temptation to have another glass of the good stuff.
Not bad. Yeah, I mean, that could work most of the time, couldn't it? I mean, why doesn't that work for like diet? Because my problem is more just eating junk. just constantly brush your teeth after eating something. I mean, that could work, couldn't it?
It might
So you're
help a
brushing
bit.
it, you'd
Yeah.
brush all the enamel off your teeth. Because I'd have to do it after that. Because I like my problem is eating chocolate and things, it's not drinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do brush my teeth a lot. I'd have to be brushing them. I already brushed them like several times a day. I mean, it would be ridiculous. I've actually ruined the enamel. I thought it was great brushing your teeth just constantly. There's actually a downside to it. You destroy the enamel. No one
Okay.
told me that. I thought
Right.
this is great. I'm nailing this with just ridiculous OCD. But there's a downside to everything, Toby. Well, I mean, I'm amazed that you've fallen off the wagon twice. I'm stunned because you said not only were you going to do dry January, you said you were going all
I
the
know.
way to Lent, is what you told
I
me.
was talking a big game. My I
I've stuck
I
to it
was yeah.
easily.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, easily. And someone I could have seen someone last night, and I didn't, but I wouldn't have drank anyway. And then I've got a birthday thing. I won't drink at that. It's very easy for me. Very easy.
I
So
should
we're
say
just
that I
different
I
people.
definitely feel better for drinking less, albeit not being completely on the wagon. I'm sleeping better, my head's clearer, I'm getting more admin done. So yeah, I can definitely see the benefits.
I guess the
Uh,
the inevitable question there is how much do you normally drink? That still drinking quite a lot feels
I know.
amazing, like a total cleanse and detox. Just drinking a normal amount for you is like is like going to a wellness retreat and drinking green juices. Just drinking still quite a lot of wine, but not.
I know. By limiting myself to drinking just one bottle a night on 2 nights a week, I feel transformed.
That is ridiculous. But what is impressive is how you do so much work. I mean, you can go out and be hammered at like 3 a.m. because I've been there, and then the next day I'm basically useless till the afternoon. But you're up at like 8 or something, cranking out articles and meeting government people and putting through bills and stuff. How is that just genetic luck?
I think it's just genetic luck. Yeah, I had a conversation at one of these dinners that I fell off the wagon at. Um, a well-known historian took me to one side and said he'd read my piece in the Spectator, and he interpreted it as, not an article about how to cut down on your drinking, but how to combine drinking with doing a lot of work. And he told me his secret, which is he gets up at 4:30 a.m. every day, does a serious amount of work, does serious work for 6 hours, then takes a break and does an hour's worth of admin, then has a nice lunch, might have a glass of wine with lunch, and then has a nap after lunch, and then gets up again, does another couple of hours work, and then goes out for the evening and drinks like a normal person, several glasses of wine, gets home, tries to get to bed before midnight, rinse and repeat. And that to me was absolutely extraordinary. He said the nap means that you turn one day into two. So he effectively he does 2 days work in one by bisecting it with this nap every day. He said that's the secret. But it would take just me, and I mean that is a level of willpower and self-discipline I simply don't possess, to get up every day at 4:30 a.m. and do 6 hours work, and then at 10:30 think about doing the admin. I mean, my work starts with the admin usually. Anyway, so that was impressive.
That's extraordinary. Yeah, I mean that is. I've heard people say that. I've even heard people like divide their day into 4 and they get like 4 days and stuff. But that is amazing. That is like Churchillian, isn't it? With the naps and the extra day.
Yeah,
My problem,
yeah.
I mean, I've sometimes gone through phases of getting up at like 5 a.m. as an experiment. But basically, I can't do it now because I get back at 1 a.m. from work. And then I just tend to stay up till honestly all night. I've just written an article about this on my Substack. I'm an insomniac, but it's just mine. But the good thing about it is I get to follow American politics live, which we'll get into in a minute, maybe.
We'll talk
That's
about
the
it
only
later. Yep.
positive. But yeah, other than that, it's a nightmare. But let's kick off then with the first story, which I thought would do the Tories facing 1997 style wipeout the Telegraph have. And they said it's the most extensive election poll in 5 years, predicts the party will retain just 169 seats. 11 cabinet ministers forecast to be ousted in biggest collapse since 1906. So Keir Starmer's Labour, I'm annoyed that I said sir there, I never say sir. Keir Starmer's Labour would win landslide majority of 120 with 385 MPs. Now this poll came from Lord Frost, our friend Lord Frost, regular listener, who I thought about texting about this, but then I didn't because I thought it might be tricky for him to answer. But he did this, he sort of commissioned this poll as far as I can see. And people were saying, why did he release it now? Was it to do with influencing the Rwanda vote? That is possible. Is he just trying to give the Tories a kick up the backside? I don't know. You'll be able to shed more light on this, perhaps, Toby. But yes, he commissioned this devastating YouGov poll with proper data and MRP. He says this YouGov MRP is robust to much of this, so it takes into account all sorts of things. And it's constituency level data. He says these MRP polls have huge samples and give us detailed constituency level data, and it's basically incredibly bad. And it doesn't even factor reform. But if you factor in Nigel Farage coming back to reform, it's even worse. So can Rishi survive, and can the Tories not even survive but avoid a landslide defeat?
Yeah. So I think that David Frost certainly had a role in this poll, but he didn't technically commission it. It was commissioned by a group called Conservative. Oh, I had it up in my
it's
screen.
Conservative Britain Alliance or something, isn't it?
Conservative Britain Alliance. No one's ever heard of this group. So it looks like a group that's sprung up fairly recently. And David Frost produced an analysis of the poll and wrote an accompanying piece for The Telegraph. And according to a piece by Andrew Pearce in yesterday's Daily Mail, David Frost also at one stage was fundraising to fund this poll. The poll cost about £70,000. So the question you ask is the right one, which is, well, why have they commissioned this poll? And why have they published it now? And the answer appears to be that whoever is behind it want to, the kind of more charitable interpretation is that they just want Rishi's to stiffen his backbone over the Rwanda Bill and accept these amendments that have been proposed by people who don't think it goes far enough and it contains too many loopholes which could be taken advantage of by human rights lawyers. And so they want to increase pressure on Rishi to accept these amendments by making it clear that the Tories are on course for a landmark defeat unless they get tough on immigration. The less charitable interpretation is that actually the people behind this poll want Rishi to go and want to trigger another leadership election because they don't want Rishi to lead the party into the next general election. And as the poll suggests, if he does, it'll be a Charge of the Light Brigade style wipeout. I think I incline towards the less charitable interpretation. I think this is part of the kind of plot to unseat, to dethrone Rishi. And of course, the reason for publishing the poll this week is because this week is crunch week for Rishi. Today, the amendments that have been proposed to the Rwanda Bill by people on the right of the party are being debated. The bill is at the committee stage when amendments are debated, and if those amendments are rejected by the close of play tomorrow, then there will be a vote, a third reading on the Rwanda Bill, and the likelihood is not certain, but anyway, probable. I think that if the amendments are rejected, then the Rwanda Bill will be defeated at the third reading, and then Rishi faces a dilemma. Does he hold an election? Does he turn it into a confidence vote? So if he is defeated, it automatically triggers an election. Does he not do that, but hold an election anyway if the third reading is defeated? Or if it's defeated, does he resign? Or does he resign on the eve of the third reading because he knows it'll be defeated? Anything could happen in the next 48 hours, maybe even less than that. I think in all probability, some amended version of some of the amendments will be accepted, and that means the crunch vote, the third reading of the Rwanda Bill, will then be postponed until next week, so that'll give Rishi an opportunity to shore up a bit of support. But it looks to me as though whether this current plot succeeds or not, Rishi's confidence in Rishi is ebbing away pretty quickly. He's losing his authority. It's that moment. You can see that moment approaching. Usually when Prime Minister's authority begins to ebb away, it happens quickly, then suddenly. And sorry,
Like
it
going
happened
bankrupt.
slowly, then suddenly, like going bankrupt. Yeah, and you can. It feels to me as though that's beginning to happen, and it's not going to be Rishi leading the party into the next general election.
Interesting. And we can talk about who it would be. But I was actually right with Conservative Britain Alliance, so I'm quite impressed with my memory there. The Independent phrases it as a group of Tory donors who have called themselves Conservative Britain Alliance, led by Lord Frost. So it does say they're led by him. I don't know exactly how that works, but certainly he's involved, and it's not great. So are you saying Kemi then, and they try and get her in with enough time for a November-ish election?
Yeah, well, interestingly, one of the things this poll predicts is that various Tory grandees currently in the cabinet are going to lose their seats. I think it was 12 in total, and they included Jeremy Hunt and Penny Mordaunt, two potential leadership contenders. And maybe the subliminal, not so subliminal message there is there's really little point in voting for either of them because they may not even be in Parliament after the next general election. But it looks as though Kemi, if there is a plot, it looks as though their candidate is Kemi. And interestingly, a story broke at the same time that this poll was published saying Kemi thinks that the Rwanda Bill needs to be amended. And of course, two deputy chairs of the Conservative Party have also declared they're going to back the amendments. Brendan Clark Smith and Lee Anderson. So when cabinet ministers and deputy chairs of the party are, joining the conspirators, if that's what it is, it looks like time will shortly be up for Rishi. But yeah, I think Kemi will be pitched, if he does resign and there is a leadership election, as a unity candidate. And I think there'll be strong pressure on all the other people who fancy their chances, like Penny Mordaunt, to just not contest the leadership. So it's a coronation, not a contest. Because it looks as though even if someone contested it, Kemi would, at the very least, be in the final two, and she would win a ballot of the members, particularly if she was up against someone like Jeremy Hunt. So I think the hope the conspirators are harbouring, if it's a conspiracy, is that Rishi will resign, and Kemi will then be appointed in his place, uncontested.
Well, yeah. So one of the things Kemi wanted was she was talking about she wanted to limit the individual appeals to deportations, didn't she? That's what it was. And Lee Anderson agreed with her. You wouldn't be able
Mm,
to individually appeal your deportation. That's what I think it
mm.
was. Someone can write in and tell me I've got it slightly wrong in some way, but I think that's correct. And that's what the sort of right of the party was going for. So that's fascinating. I mean, we do talk about it a lot, but can reform make a massive difference? I mean, one part that struck me of Lord Frost's article was when he said that this doesn't factor in a further boost for Reform UK. Just imagine if Nigel Farage delivered on his hints and came back to politics. 2 or 3 extra points for reform, a bit more tactical voting, and this might start to look like an extinction event. So
Mm.
he's saying it could obliterate the Tories forever. I mean, is Richard Tice right? Can reform become the new Tories, or is that just unrealistic in our system? And is it still going to have to be about reforming the Tory party and getting someone like Kemi in?
Well, um, let's suppose Rishi clings on, or calls a snap election, um, and the Conservatives are wiped out, and Reform does reasonably well, but probably doesn't win any seats. But does well because, in part, because Nigel has kind of come back to lead the party in the general election campaign. Um, I'm not sure that would mean Reform replacing the Conservative Party. I imagine that in those circumstances, the rump of the Parliamentary Conservative Party would, or the rump that will be the post-election Parliamentary Conservative Party, will regroup, elect a leader, and I would have thought would quite quickly start picking up um, uh, support from people unhappy with Labour. But one concern, I think, is that if Labour wins the majority projected by this particular poll, and that's assuming Rishi doesn't go and he leads the party into the election whenever it is, then it would be such a large majority, like a bigger majority even than that won by Tony Blair, I think, in 1997, that it's inconceivable that it wouldn't be at the very least a two-term Labour government. So the message of the poll is, if we don't replace Rishi, then we'll be looking at least 10 years in the political wilderness.
Unless Starmer's just so bad. I know that's all the predictions. It would be 2 terms. Unless Starmer's just so bad that he only gets 1 term. But yeah, it's certainly going to be a long time in the wilderness if they even survive. It is hard to imagine the Tories falling apart because they've been the most successful political party in Western Europe or something. I mean, something like that. So
I think,
but
rumors of their death have been greatly exaggerated. I think, it's very unlikely that the Tory party would, actually become extinct. I suppose it's possible it might split into different factions, like the Conservative Party in Canada did. That's possible. There might be a kind of rival Conservative Party set up, which then eclipsed the Conservative Party. But with our electoral system, it's obviously very difficult for challenger parties to succeed, as we've discussed many times before.
And in this poll, the Tories would lose 196 seats versus 178 in 97. And they're saying it's only slightly smaller than Blair's majority because the SNP would still hold 20-odd seats that were Labour in 97. But there are all sorts of different projections in this, but it's definitely worth reading the article. It's certainly not good for the Tories. I can't actually picture Rishi going for some reason, but then again, I could be wrong because Boris suddenly went quite suddenly. That was quite shocking. Obviously, Partygate rumbled on, but then there was Chris Pincher, and he went quite suddenly and did that fairly bitter speech outside the Commons, and them as the breaks and all that, and it was very sudden. So maybe it can happen. For some reason I can't picture it. Maybe just because they've had so much turmoil already, but I also can't picture him surviving. He's not going to survive after the election anyway. So it's not academic, but it's not good for Rishi either way, is it? He goes now or he goes.
I mean,
in November.
It's possible that none of the amendments are accepted. There is, the third reading of the Rwanda Bill takes place tomorrow, and it's narrowly won by the government. So the rebellion fails, the coup fails. But even in that scenario, the conspirators will then start sending letters to the 1920-22 committee, and if the 22 receives enough letters, then that automatically triggers a leadership election. So Rishi's not out of the woods, even if the third reading of the Rwanda Bill passes tomorrow night, which is why I say it feels as though his authority is ebbing away, and to me it now looks unlikely that he'll lead the party into the next general election.
He was just kind of the wrong person at the wrong time. I mean, he could have been okay in a more stable time, but we haven't had such a time for ages. I mean, Dominic Cummings has said politicians just want to go back to the time post Berlin Wall, pre 9/11. He says they all just want to go back to that time, and all their policies are about trying to get back to that time. But we're not in that time. We're in a time of change and turmoil. And so he was the wrong guy for that moment. We need someone much bolder, and he's more managerial. And that's why it's interesting that Frost says that complacency has been the tone in his piece, and he says that might sound strange, but it's been all about complacency, with people saying, "Well, people don't like Starmer, and it's not as bad as you think, and people might stay home, but they won't vote Labour," and all these kind of theories. But really, they're sort of sleepwalking into oblivion. That's quite a good phrase, sleepwalking into oblivion. The Rishi Sunak story.
I imagine the spin that Team Rishi will put on it, if he does go, is that the Conservative Party's just become unmanageable. The Parliamentary Conservative Party. That it doesn't matter how gifted a leader you are, it really wouldn't have mattered. Had he been bolder, and embraced a more red-blooded policy on the small boats, had he abandoned net zero, then he would have lost the right of his party.
Nation.
And would have faced, a succession of rebellions on that side of the aisle. The team Rishi spin will be the Tory party's just become unmanageable, and no one can herd these cats. That'll be the line, I think.
Yeah, and there
No
is
fault
something
of
in that when
Rishi's.
you've got the 5 families. You've got the One Nation, then you've got various different conservative factions, some of whom are more Thatcherite, some of whom are more NatCon, whatever you want to call it. It is virtually impossible, to be fair to him. I mean, that wouldn't be completely made up, would it? It is
No,
multiple
no.
parties. In our system, it has to be this broad church. Then it gets so broad that it can't even survive anymore. And that's basically where we are, isn't it? Potentially, anyway.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think that Kemi would have fewer issues than Rishi, because the parliamentary party would recognise that it really is drinking in the last chance saloon under Kemi. There isn't going to be another leadership election between her winning the next one and the general election. So I think they would put on a show of unity, and also she'd have if she was elected unopposed. Rishi's authority has always been slightly weak from the get-go because he lost the actual contest with Liz. So in the only thing approaching a democratic election within the Conservative Party, he lost it to Liz, and it was only after she was overthrown by conspirators seemingly in league with him that he then replaced her. And I think that I think Kemi would have a bit more legitimacy because you wouldn't have had, a failed runoff kind of behind her with someone who was then deposed. As I say, I think the party would recognise it has to unite behind her, and she's got she's got a bit more natural authority, natural gravitas, a bit more bottom than him. I mean, part of his problem is he's not a very good communicator, is he? He's not great at kind of connecting with the public. He always seems a bit, as though he's trying a little bit too hard, and you're not really seeing the real Rishi. You're seeing this kind of, charming kind of salesman, but that's not what he's really like, behind closed doors. There's something a little bit inauthentic and he's a bit too cheerful and positive and high energy in a slightly unconvincing way. It's all, it just feels like a kind of slightly second-rate political act, whereas she seems much more real, much more relatable. What you see is what you get. She's got that kind of stamp of authenticity, which he's never had.
Yeah, they're both very smart, but yes, Sunak has a kind of charisma deficit. He would have been more suited, as I've said before, this is my layman take, but he would have been more suited to go with Cummings, when you had these meetings with Cummings. Why not go with a radical kind of Cummings agenda, run the country like a CEO, talk about efficiency, reform the civil service, scrap the ECHR, sort out that nuclear missiles thing, do all these things, sort out immigration in a very tough way. Why not be the kind of managerial CEO candidate, the sort of non-ideological? Because that suits Rishi. And so Cummings said he's harder working than most politicians. He's smarter than most politicians. But as he pointed out, he doesn't have a story. He doesn't have an identity. He's never nailed the campaigning sort of the part you need to connect to voters. As we've been proved, he's not been elected by the country or the members. He's stuck, and he's reverted to sort of playing the Whitehall game. I think his only chance was a kind of radical Cummings-esque agenda, personally.
But I think it would have been very difficult, as we've discussed, for him to, unite the parliamentary party behind that radical, properly conservative agenda. I think it'll be easier for Kemi to do that after she's won an election on that basis. I mean, maybe she'll, call an election straight away if she succeeds him. It'll be a single issue election on the issue of whether we stay in or come out of the ECHR, because as long as we remain in, there's not much we can do about the small boats. Or she'll make it, an election about a cluster of issues. But once if she manages to actually win a majority in extremely difficult circumstances, in the teeth of all the predictions, like Major did in '92, then she'd have real authority. If she can fight an election on that basis, she would then be able to appeal to the manifesto and say, "Look, we've been elected to enact this radical right wing agenda," and that would, I think, help her silence the kind of dissenting elements in the parliamentary party. Rishi can't point to a manifesto. The manifesto in 2019 has long since ceased to mean very much because there've been, 2 changes of prime minister since Boris won that election. So, but with that mandate, I think maybe Kemi could, bring the parliamentary party, get them behind her, united behind this radical agenda.
Yeah, just to be clear, though, I think those are 2 different agendas. I think the Dominic Cummings agenda is a non-ideological efficiency agenda that just tries to fix big problems. People like the NHS. Okay, let's reform the NHS, but keep it and put more money into it. People are worried about immigration. Let's fix that. I see that as a different agenda from, and it's that's why people are scared of Cummings. He doesn't believe in the political centre ground. He doesn't really believe. He doesn't believe in things like that. He just thinks people have a radical mix of views. For example, people are pro NHS, but they're also pro death penalty in many cases for certain types of crimes. So it's like he's more about sort of, you could call it a radical populism. I sort of see it as like an efficient populism or something. Curtis Yarvin has spoken about we should just have a CEO type figure, an absolute monarch, but he really means a CEO type figure running the country. I see that as the Cummings agenda. I haven't read enough of his stuff to understand it all. There's just acres of stuff about Bismarck that I don't understand, but that's my broad understanding. The Kemi agenda I see as different. That I see as the more straightforward conservative agenda we might want, but do the public want it is the big question. You can see how the party could win Danny Kruger, Miriam Cates, and others, and you can see how that's building momentum in the party. The question is, as much as I want that, does the nation want that, or do they still want this wet one nation thing? I don't know. We'll find out, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think there does seem to be a real public appetite for doing more about the small boats and protecting our borders. And I also think that there seems to be a kind of burgeoning opposition to net zero, particularly as people realise the cost. So I think you could win a mandate to address both of those issues in a way which would, please people like Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, whether I think, I guess you're right. There was a really interesting piece by N.S. Lyons actually on his Substack this week, in which he talked about what he called right-wing progressivism, which he associates with people like Curtis Yarvin, in which the object of government should be to maximise growth. And as you say, they think that that's sort of ideologically uncontentious. They're anti-woke, but only because anti-woke kind of hurts the bottom line. They think the head of state should see his job or her job as maximising GDP, increasing
woke
growth.
hurts the bottom line, so they're anti-woke.
Yeah, but they're not anti-woke for more fundamental ideological reasons.
You just said anti-woke hurts the bottom line. I got it now.
Yeah, but N.S. Lyons makes the point that this isn't really a conservative position, because it contains within it a kind of progressive vision, the view that things are always going to get better, a kind of an unwillingness to acknowledge that things were actually better in the past, and there are aspects of our past which are worth preserving. So he said it was really just it's a sort of way of grafting onto kind of right-wing libertarianism what is essentially a progressive agenda. So he was opposed to it as a kind of proper conservative.
There are so many visions of conservatism. You've then got Bannon's traditionalism, Steve Bannon, where he believes in the fourth turning and believes that there are 4 cycles to history, which is radically different from linear progression, obviously, because he believes sometimes we're in a dark phase. I think I've said it before, but there's an amusing bit from his book where Jared Kushner is sort of worrying about, should we bomb Syria or something. And Bannon's going, oh yeah, but sometimes we may as well because we're in like a dark phase or something. Like he's like an accelerationist. Like let's just let this bit get as bad as possible because the good bit's coming around the corner because he's got this kind of zany fourth turning traditionalism. And people were quite sort of, some people were a bit worried at how close he was to the seat of power with some of these idiosyncratic, let's say, esoteric views. So there's so many different visions of conservatism. Go on.
I guess one question is, there is a kind of sense of kind of apocalyptic millenarian kind of panic almost kind of hanging over Britain and maybe politics internationally. That the capitalist model is no longer capable of producing perpetual growth, that the rules-based world order is collapsing. We seem closer to a third world war, what with the conflict between Israel and Gaza and the brewing conflict between China and Taiwan and the increasingly aggressive, belligerent behavior of Iran, the possibility that Putin may yet triumph in the war in Ukraine and then begin to menace other states in the Baltic. So there's a kind of general sense of kind of panic that things are falling apart, that Western civilization, the values we live by, our way of life has never been more fragile, never been at greater risk. And maybe everyone always exaggerates, exactly, the extent of the jeopardy we're in. But the more that feeling kind of grows, and the more that kind of that kind of narrative is embedded, so the political solutions that seem to be available to us, such as Keir Starmer reviving kind of Blairite social democracy, or by contrast, in various European countries like France, some kind of populist alternative to kind of techno-managerialism. They don't seem like particularly good solutions that are going to address these problems. So that to me feels like a reason for developing a kind of properly thought through, properly conservative government agenda. But maybe I'm being naive if I think we could have a kind of, Thatcherism 2.0 that could kind of reverse Britain's decline, inject us with a kind of new sense of national purpose and economic confidence. Maybe that too is an illusion, and no one really has got a solution for what feels like the inevitable coming collapse of our civilization. What do you think? How optimistic are you?
You know me, I'm always optimistic. I think, I think we could have that figure for Thatcher 2.0. Who is that if not Nigel Farage? I mean, that's virtually a description of him. My theory is Starmer, as you know, Starmer gets in, balls up the country, then Farage comes through. I say as leader of the Conservatives, maybe it's as reform, and he just somehow destroys the Conservatives via reform. We're behind Europe. I don't see it going anywhere else. I think immigration is such a big issue. We've had more excessive immigration than virtually anyone. Europe has Hertwilders. It has, the toughening of policy on immigration in France, Denmark, Sweden. We have the AfD in Germany. I know they're trying to stop them by undemocratic means, but that's where it's going in Europe. I see us as behind that curve, but we will get there. But we'll get there in an English way that'll have a variation. But maybe that is someone like Farage, because Farage is one of these figures. He sort of combines patriotism and populism and nationalism with Thatcherite economics, so that can be done. I don't really see why not. Whether it's a viable solution when capitalism, you're saying, is under threat, I don't know. But maybe.
Well, I guess,
yeah.
Well, the reason that I'm slightly skeptical about whether the various populist parties, which look as though, and candidates which look as though they will do well in many elections this year, the reason I'm skeptical about whether they can address these long-term problems and reverse the decline of the West is that, to a great extent, they're just reactionary, aren't they? They're just kind of an explosion of rage in the face of the complacency and arrogance of the Davos class, and they don't really have any well thought through, well worked out policy solutions to these problems. I mean, one of the things which makes Dominic Cummings quite impressive, in spite of all his shortcomings, is that he does appear to have done some proper intellectual labour and devise what he thinks is a kind of set of policies which will set Britain back on the right foot, including civil service reform. But other populist parties, I mean, I like Nigel Farage, I like Richard Tice. If Rishi remains the leader of the Conservative Party going into the election, I'll probably vote Reform. But beyond, coming out of the ECHR and properly defending our borders, do they really have any policies? What are their policies? I'm not sure I know what they are. Do they have an education policy? Do they have a policy to get people back into work? How are they going to address the fact that the number of people on disability benefit is mushrooming, and ordinary Britons seem less and less inclined to work? What are they going to do about our below replacement birth rate? What are they going to do about the overwhelmed NHS? Are they really going to reform the NHS? They're not very keen on net zero. Great. Maybe they'd repeal the Net Zero Act. But beyond that, I'm not sure that they have a kind of a set of policies which could really address these problems, or that they've really had a chance to think that through or come up with a kind of proper program for government. It would be very entertaining, a lot of fun, but
yeah.
Would it solve our problems?
Well, I did interview Richard Tice on my podcast, The Current Thing, and he did have a lot of answers for those questions. They did have a policy about NHS and wages. I don't exactly recall it. They had a progressive tax policy on the income tax threshold that was pretty good, and they've now released a series of very effective tweets showing just how massive immigration has been. How absurdly huge the numbers have been in the last year compared to our entire history. But you are right that. And I think we have to be fair to Rich and say, well, you got to go through his manifesto. But I do think you have a point. When I talk about Farage, I am sort of falling perhaps for the sort of savior syndrome, the kind of Javier Milei, although he has done some good stuff himself, the sort of Trump, the charismatic, what's it called? There's a term for it, charismatic authority. I think it comes from Max Weber from memory, something like that. It's the idea of you just have one charismatic leader and to kind of solve everything, but it's a kind of an illusion. And there is a danger of that. As you say, at least Cummings has thought these things through. Trump had Bannon, who had intellectually thought everything through. His agenda was scrapped pretty quickly, as far as I can gather. He was ousted, of course. So you maybe do need that person behind you who's really thought through the policies, that nerd behind the charismatic person. So yeah, what would that look like? I think that is a very legitimate question. Will it be? It can't be exactly the same as Europe's kind of right wing, but it'll be something, an English spin on that. But yeah, we don't have it yet. You're right. And as for birth rates, that's a great question. I just interviewed Dr. Paul Morland on The Current Thing. We went through this in detail. I highly recommend it. That question, yeah, I said, have politicians addressed this? And he didn't, basically not really. They haven't addressed this. This is the concern. I mean, there's immigration, but behind that is birth rates, because the reason for immigration, or one of the reasons, the only decent reason, or even viable reason, as I see it, is okay, it's plugging the economy, but behind that is the low birth rates, and that's the root issue of all of it. And immigration only plugs it temporarily. Is it in a kind of Ponzi scheme, because then they get old, they need to be looked after, and so on? And do they even fill the gaps? Are they even skilled? So yeah, it's all about the birth rates, and no one has come up with a great idea for how we get domestic birth rates up. Nothing has really worked as far as I can see. So, but it's an open question. How do we fix that? But you're right. I'd like to hear. We're not hearing Starmer coming through and say, well, this is what I do about immigration, and then here's what I do with the birth rate. It's not even on the map of any party, really, and this is a potential existential issue.
Well, it's difficult certainly for someone like Starmer to come up with a policy, because if he suggests that he thinks women should be having more children, then he immediately gets kind of attacked by the feminists in his party.
Muslim base would like him.
Yeah, hasn't
not if he said only white children that lives the Muslim. Can you imagine Starmer coming out with anything? I mean, he's so careful. He doesn't say anything. He just tries to not drop the Ming vase. He can't answer anything. Imagine him suddenly coming out with a bold policy on birth rates and how to get them up. I mean, that's just so inconceivable.
No, it's seemingly the only really bold policy agenda unveiled by Keir Starmer and his top team so far is to essentially undo all the Conservative education reforms, which is the one reform I think you can say over the past 13, 14 years of Conservative and coalition government that's been an unqualified success. I mean, the only thing they've really got right is education reform. England and Wales, England in particular, England rather, not England and Wales. England is now climbing the international league tables. The policies enacted by Michael Gove and his successors, and by ministers like Nick Gibb in the Education Department, have been really successful. A return to more traditional teaching methods, an emphasis on rigorous discipline, the free schools policy, academization. I mean, they haven't all been unqualified successes, but broadly speaking, the education system we have now is much, much better than it was pre-2010. And those are the only policies, as far as we know, that Labour Party have been absolutely explicit about. So we're going to undo all the good that the Conservatives have done in education. So he wants to, scrap GCSEs. He wants to reverse the reforms to teacher training. He's going to rewrite the national curriculum. He wants much more of an emphasis on preparing children for work, so teaching them skills rather than knowledge. I mean, all the kind of nonsense, the progressive romantic nonsense that was that ruled the roost pre-2010, that's all going to come back via Labour if Starmer wins the next election. It's so depressing. I was very involved in the education reform movement for several years, and to think that it's all that good work is going to be undone is deeply demoralising.
Yeah, it's horrible. I can imagine. And they're going to do a lot of woke stuff about misgendering children. It's going to be absolutely awful. The only other policy I know about is that Angela Rayner, I don't know if she'll be allowed to do anything, but she has said she would get rid of that new minimum, what's it called, minimum service on the tube, where we finally got this rule where the tube has to have a certain minimum service. They can't totally strike, but immediately Khan didn't invoke it, and Angela Rayner says she'd scrap it entirely. So that's a new policy I know about, and that's another awful idea. And it's going to be so bad. But hey, look at the Lord Frost poll to go full circle on this story, which we've done quite a long time on. This is what people are going to vote for, so they're going to get what they asked for. They're going to get a horrible, horrible Labour government.
They'll be just voting to punish the Tories, though, won't they? They won't actually be voting for Labour's manifesto, although Labour will obviously claim it's a massive public endorsement for their manifesto and go about enacting all these dreadful policies, claiming a mandate.
Well, your mum had an old phrase about it: don't cut off your nose to spite your face, and that still holds today. Don't vote Labour just to annoy the Tories. The Tories are a disaster. You can't vote Labour. But let's see. All right, well, we did a lot on that story. Now let's go and do an occasional section we like to do, which is Across the Pond. Because, Toby, we have a massive Across the Pond story today, which is that Trump has won bigly in the Iowa caucus. He's won 51% of the vote and gained 20 delegates. And I don't pretend to understand the delegates thing, but he got 56,260 votes. Ron DeSantis, remember him, got 23,420, only 21.2%. Nikki Haley, 21,085, 19.1%. And Vivek got 8,449 votes. He got 7.7%. So, and he then dropped out and gave his endorsement to Trump. And it was all very interesting. I mean, most people are saying now, Ron DeSantis done, Haley's done, but she hasn't realized it. She claimed it showed that it was officially a 2-horse race, even though she didn't even do as well as DeSantis, which was called a delusional bitch. So by some people. So I mean, Vivek played it smart. He burst onto the scene. He said all these bold things. Very smart, great speaker, really interesting. Trump insulted him just before, didn't respond to that. Then drops out, backs Trump, says we've got to have unity, do the right thing. Never outshine the master. 48 Laws of Power, rule number 1. Never outshine the master. And he didn't outshine Trump. Ron DeSantis, bit of a mistake. Tried to outshine the master, went too soon. Did well in Florida, thought he was ready. He wasn't. I called it. Hate to say, we discussed it at length on previous podcasts. I remain Team Trump. You were Team DeSantis because you're worried about Trump's uncouth. I don't want to say put words in your mouth what the reasons were. I was Team Trump, and he's absolutely storming. And I was Team Trump instinctively because I knew that Trump's just a force of nature, and I'd also followed it very closely, and people like Roger Stone, I was quite influenced by, who said, look, Ron DeSantis doesn't like people. He's an introvert. I mean, hey, I can't fault him for either of those. It would be hypocritical. But you're up against Trump. I see it as a kind of solid Everton midfielder up against Maradona. You're up against one of the most charismatic, famous people of all time in Donald Trump. So it's very hard to beat him. So he absolutely spanked everyone. And just so the listener has some context, people were talking about 40%. A writer for Vox said if Trump underperforms polls, getting around 40% or lower, or having another contender come surprisingly close, he will be deemed a loser of Iowa, even though he won. But he didn't. He got 51%. And the last time that was done was Bob Dole, I believe, in 1988. And so it's just an absolute crushing victory for Trump. And yeah, Bob Dole, 12-point margin of victory in Iowa from 1988. He smashed past that as well. So, massive win for Trump. I don't fully claim to understand all the ins and outs of their system. But anyway, he said some funny quotes, which maybe I'll get into later. But first, Toby, any take on all of that?
Well, Bob Dole did go on to lose that presidential election.
There is that.
Yeah, it does look as though it's all over for the challenger candidates, doesn't it? I think if Nikki Haley manages to pull off an extraordinary surprise in New Hampshire next week, then it might then become a two-horse race. But as you say, it does feel a bit delusional to claim that now, given that she actually came third. Although there wasn't much distance between. There wasn't much of a gap between her and DeSantis. Yeah, it does look like Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. And I guess, my reasons for not being as enthusiastic about Trump as you are that I find it hard to take him seriously as a politician. And I worry that if he is America's next president, it'll just be another nail in the coffin of Western civilization. That is the kind of bully pulpit of the free world. The president of the United States is supposed to possess some dignity and moral authority. He is supposed to be, the leader for all of us who believe in Western values. And I'm not sure he has any of that moral authority. He just seems to be a pretty reprehensible, dishonest, unpleasant character. And it may be that the reason his first administration wasn't as disastrous as the Democrats were predicting is because there was a kind of infrastructure in place. There were many people in the White House and in the various departments of state that were still competent and able to run the country, even though they had this kind of crazy person in the White House. But maybe that won't be true second time around. Maybe a lot of them will leave. And I guess one of the problems with Trump is partly that he is such a partisan figure. Yes, he commands the loyalty, the enthusiastic affection of maybe 50% of the population, but the other 50% really detest him. And it's a bit like the problem I was worried would face Britain after the success of Brexit in the EU referendum, which is that all the people that we need on side to make a success of Brexit are all the people that voted for Remain. And are they just going to flounce off or kind of sit on their hands or work to rule and make sure that post-Brexit Britain isn't a success because they were so bitterly opposed to Brexit. And that sort of has happened up to a point. That's the reason the Home Office haven't got to grips, in part, one of the reasons the Home Office hasn't got to grips with the small boats crisis, because they're all Remainers and they're all pro-immigration. So you sort of worry that if such a partisan figure does become president, he's not going to unite the country. He's not going to get the people on side you need on side to make a success of his administration. And he's a bit of an isolationist when it comes to Europe and NATO. And if we're going to be menaced by a triumphant Putin having kind of defeated Ukraine, who will be able to call on for support? The EU? I don't think so. Will be very vulnerable. And we've discussed before, both the benefits and the costs of having someone like Trump in the White House. If, with China seemingly, determined to invade Taiwan. On the one hand, the fact that he's capable of launching a kind of, first strike with a nuclear missile will deter the Chinese. But on the other hand, if they're not deterred by that, then it's more likely we would be plunged into nuclear war. So I don't know. I think I can see why you like Trump, and I don't buy into many of the kind of deranged criticisms of Trump, and I think it'll be hugely entertaining to see all the kind of liberals crying their eyes out on election night. I worry that from the point of view of the long-term health, the future of Western civilization, it'll just be another nail in the coffin.
Well, I'm always surprised you go with the foreign policy argument or the isolationist argument, to use your word there, because that's where the argument's so weak against Trump. Because the empirical evidence, as I always say, is that the world was much safer under Trump. And since Biden, chaos in Afghanistan, the disastrous withdrawal, Ukraine-Russia war, because Putin perhaps sees the US is weak, one argument, and the chaos in the Middle East. Now we've got Yemen. I don't know if that's related, but certainly it's a much more dangerous world since Biden's come in. Okay, you can question the causation if you want, but you certainly can't question the outcome. Trump made things safer. He was tougher, and people respected it more. I mean, as for the Brexit point and sort of riling people, I see that as the kind of domestic abuse victim argument. I see it as the Churchill darkest hour. You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. I mean, the left we can't give into, especially the radical left that's taken over the Biden administration. These people can't be reasoned with. They're communists who want to destroy you at all costs. So it has to be war, not necessarily actual civil war, but it has to be very tough. And we see that from Trump's indictments, the way they're trying to put him in prison. We see how rough they're prepared to play. And we've just seen Rachel Maddow saying they're not even going to put out footage. Which ridiculous channel is she on now? MSNBC. That she's like, we're not even going to necessarily show the speech of the Republican candidate who's won. And she didn't even say his name at first, which was kind of really insane. She goes, because we don't know, we don't want to put out things that aren't true. We don't like having to do this, but we're not even going to. So like, okay, you're not even going to show Trump's speech because you're censoring the leading Republican candidate, former president. It's so disgusting and insane. That's why the Trump story is so important and so inevitable. You've tried to put this guy in prison. Now he has to win. It has to be total victory. And I know some people are uncomfortable with Trump's vernacular. They're uncomfortable. They prefer DeSantis. He's more genteel. That's never bothered me because maybe from my background, Trump seems normal given the kind of things people said in northern playgrounds. And just on that last point, and you can respond to any of that, some of the things he said were absolutely hilarious. And he said, we're going to drill, baby, drill, which is funny on its own. But then he also said, I had to write this down and tweet it because I was watching his victory speech in the early hours of the morning because I'm always up very late. And he said, so I don't want to be overly rough on the president, but I have to say that he is the worst president that we've had in the history of our country. I don't want to be overly rough on Biden, but he's the worst president we've had in the history of our country. I mean, that is pure Trump. Then he told an ill-judged anecdote about Jimmy Carter. I think he was at Jimmy Carter's wife's funeral. And he goes, and I was looking at, and he shouldn't have set it up like that with the funeral. He's like, and I was looking at Jimmy Carter thinking, he must be loving this now. Jimmy's not going to be the worst president we've ever had. And that didn't get any laughs because it's like, you've set it up talking about his wife's funeral, Trump. But anyway, classic Trump. Anyway, right of reply to any of that, Toby.
Well, I think you articulate the case for Trump pretty well, but it feels to me like um, it's the case for electing someone that's going to punish, people on the other side in the culture war. What could be more guaranteed to upset them, to prove them wrong, to make them look ridiculous for trying to prosecute him and for trying to censor him, than for him to win a landslide in the presidential election? And you get a huge amount of kind of, satisfaction from seeing the other side scatter and seeing the disarray, the misery he'd sow amongst the kind of libtards. But that's not going to be great for the future of the country and by extension the future of the free world. He just doesn't seem like. He seems a little crazy. I mean, maybe more than a little crazy. I mean, do you want a crazy person in the White House? I mean, I know Biden's, got all sorts of shortcomings too. Maybe he is the worst president in the history of the United States, but that doesn't mean there isn't someone, better than Trump. It just feels like it's a manifestation of kind of partisan feeling in the culture war. And it feels like, if we're going to secure the future of America and the future of the West, we have to, at some point, transcend that and be a little bit more responsible and not put in the White House someone who is so divisive and who, as you say, may even stimulate some kind of civil war, whether kind of it's a cold civil war or a hot civil war.
Yeah, well, the one thing I can say to that is, yes, there's an element of that. There's an element of dopamine rush for me. What would you call it? Not hubris, but there's an element of revenge. Yeah, fine, definitely. But the argument against is Bannon always talked about the signal and the noise, and so you have to separate the signal and the noise with Trump, and the people are unable to do that. If they were able to do that, they'd realize, oh, his policies weren't that radical. Oh, he did prison reform for black people, so they weren't even that conservative, his policies. There were some that were more than others. He put in the judges in the Supreme Court and so on, but he wasn't that crazy. It wasn't a dictatorship. It wasn't that radical. A lot of it was quite ineffective, unfortunately. And he even, did the lockdowns and the vaccines, so which was bad from my perspective. So, if they could all just calm down about the persona of Trump, they'd realize it's not going to be that bad. And they've created this monster in their heads and they've made him far worse. But yeah, given that that's where we are, it is going to be a bit like you say. But who is this other candidate, Toby? You see, because they were pushing Nikki Haley. They weren't even pushing your guy DeSantis, which maybe we could have talked about. They, meaning the system, as Vivek keeps pointing out, they want it to be a two-horse race between Haley and Trump, and then they want Haley, and they want to somehow knock Trump out of the race. And that's just, you could say it's conspiracy theory, but they certainly seem to be trying that. They want Haley, who's just the most awful, someone called her Hillary in red. She's the most awful neocon establishment, deep state nonsense candidate. So imagine that. Would you have if it's Trump versus Nikki Haley, that's a good question, actually. Who would you take out of those two?
Well, I think isn't there a pretty, I
answer the question. I want to be like one of these BBC people. Trump or Haley?
To be honest, I haven't really done much digging into Nikki Haley.
That's not an answer.
Don't know much about her, so I don't know whether I certainly still prefer DeSantis.
Well, that's a cop-out.
But I was going to say, you kind of, part of your argument for Trump is this, I think, false dichotomy. It's either, more of the same with the deep state, the woke libtards, the internationalists, the globalists, the international ruling elite, the Davos class, or it's Trump, a radical populist kind of alternative who's going to kind of who's going to inflict kind of misery on those elites. But isn't there a third alternative, which and I agree that he doesn't seem to be in the race at the moment, you have to choose between the candidates that have a chance of winning. But I like to imagine that there is somewhere a politician who can combine a kind of radical conservative program for renewal with a bit of moral authority, a bit of dignity. Someone more like Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she was a little bit partisan. She was quite divisive. She had kind of, she was a bit of a culture warrior. But at the same time, there was a kind of a properly thought out political philosophy there. She was immersed in the work of people like Friedrich Hayek. She knew what the Austrian school in economics was. She worked closely with think tanks like the Centre for Policy Studies. She had kind of policy nerds like Keith Joseph in the background. She was a serious politician, and that's why she was so effective and why she did bring about a period of national renewal and stop the rot. And it's someone like that I yearn for and I would vote for. And it feels a bit pessimistic to think that henceforth the choice is only going to be between these kind of populist firebrands and kind of the desiccated remnants of the kind of New World Order. Can't there be an alternative? I mean, I quite like, Javier Milei, and someone a bit more like him would be so much more attractive, I think, to Trump, more attractive than Trump.
Well, there's good news because
someone like that isn't in the race.
Well, there's good news because I have someone like that for you, but I do want to quickly address your Thatcher point. Thatcher, I see Thatcher more in the Roger Scruton way, that she was an instinctive conservative who, and that's more her legacy, or perhaps was more key to her than the Hayek stuff, which is really a crash course in libertarian economics that she got from various advisors. That's become known as Thatcherism, but I think maybe more her inherent patriotism and sort of just strength of character was more the legacy than, or more important, more fundamental than that stuff. But we could debate that, and you probably know more about it than me. But I know she did read Hayek and all that, but to me, I saw that as more something she sort of swatted up on last minute. But she was certainly serious. And Vivek is the guy for you, Toby. That's the guy I'm proposing for you. You just have to wait till 2028 is all. But he is everything you've just outlined there. I mean, he's incredibly smart. People talk about it, just incredibly high IQ, just taking in concepts, immediately adding them to his platform. If he hears about the truckers, for example, and their plight, he'll immediately add it and say, okay, that's a serious thing we've got to add. And the criticism would be he's just shoehorning it in as a talking point. But you could also just say, no, he thinks it's a morally serious point. And Mike Cernovich wrote this in a long piece about, or long ex-post about being on the campaign trail with Vivek. And people say, Candace Owens as well, they said, look, this guy's the real deal. There's these ridiculous smears on him, like he took money from Soros when he was younger, which was just like a scholarship when he was younger from one of the Soroses, which he wouldn't have even pieced together at the time, and no one used to know who George Soros was. So there's always conspiracies against Vivek. Oh, he's fake and all this. But I think he's the real deal as much as anyone is. And he is ultra intellectual, ultra smart, ultra successful, high energy, has this genetic freak energy that the Toby Youngs have, although I'm sure he doesn't probably drink as a Hindu, I doubt it, but he can get up and just go for hours on not much sleep. And that's just luck. Not all of us have it. And apparently there's a sort of personality profile of billionaires, by the way, that they just have this insane energy. But he's got the energy, the brains. He's smart enough to back Trump now, knowing that hopefully he gets the endorsement in future next time around. But you just have to wait a few years. What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think Vivek is impressive. He isn't the finished article, and it's not surprising that he hasn't done better and that he's now dropped out. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe he will have another run at it in 4 years' time, maybe 8 years' time. I agree. He's the nearest thing to Javier Milei that in American politics, and I'm sorry he's out of the race.
And your guy DeSantis, I just wanted to add one more thing on this, which I picked up on, which is that he has millions of followers, but he only follows one person, 4.6 million, and he only follows one person. Do you know who it is?
No.
It's his wife. Now,
his wife, yeah.
Bit gay. I mean, the word uxorious exists for a reason. Okay, I've always loved this word uxorious. I've always found it comical that there is a word for an excessive love of one's wife, because you would think surely you're meant to love one's wife. But no, we're smart enough to have this word uxorious. Where you can go overboard on loving your wife. Like, it's all right that you like her, but tone it down, all right? Within reason. So to only
But
follow your own wife is a bit
I
gay.
don't see. That is a little bit odd, but I don't see the word uxorious as necessarily being pejorative. You seem to take it for granted that it's a pejorative.
It is a pejorative,
whereas,
yeah. Let's just look it up
I don't
on
think so.
Google. Having or showing a great or excessive fondness for one's wife. It's always. I can get my English dictionary. I'm going to go and get it right now.
Yeah, I've never thought of that as an insult. I always thought of it more as a compliment.
Let's go to the concise Oxford. Sorry, Toby, I don't know if you carried on talking while I was away. Presumably you did. I just really wanted to get this right for the listener. I think this is a exciting key moment on the podcast, is me looking up words. Feel free to say something while I'm doing that.
Okay, I'm just making a note so we can cut this bit out.
Yes, so here we are in the concise Oxford. Greatly or excessively fond of one's wife, showing such fondness. So exactly the same. So it's the excessively that I always picked up upon. Why is it? It can't tone it down. That's the word. So he's only following his wife, and it is actually significant because, apart from me making a misogynist joke, because she allegedly sort of, convinced him to run. One hears. So did his wife, who he only follows on X, is the only person he follows, push him into running too soon?
Maybe.
Touch of the carries.
Why isn't there an equivalent?
I think she's called Casey, isn't she? Very similar. Casey DeSantis, Carrie Johnson. Are we seeing it?
But I think she's quite conservative. She's and parts company with Carrie on that score. But why isn't there an equivalent word, Nick, to describe excessive love of one's husband? Is it because
men
that's
are awesome?
Is it because,
because no one's ever done it? No woman's ever done that.
So yes, I
doesn't
think that's more
exist.
likely. It's not that no one would think to come up with that word because it's such a natural feeling to have. No, it's because no wife has an excessive regard for
We
her
don't even
husband.
need a word, lads. It's not going to come up. All right. We haven't even found a woman that likes her husband all that much yet. We're still looking for that, let alone an excessive love or fondness. Whereas we know men can be simps. Uxorious was the old-fashioned way of saying simp, but just for your wife. You're simping for your own wife. Would you say you're uxorious, Toby?
I think I am quite uxorious. Yes,
I think you are a little.
yes,
I didn't want to say.
Maybe that's
your
why I
wife
don't
is
think
very
of it as an
impressive.
insult.
I can see why you would be, but she's a very impressive person. But tone it down a little. All right.
I'm not sure being excessively fond of his wife is what did for Ron DeSantis. I don't think the American Republican voters have penalized him for that. I think that's just coincidental.
Well, no, but she forced him to run too soon. He wasn't ready. He got carried away. He's like, I won Florida. And he balls it up because he just didn't have what it takes. And by the way, I'll say one further note. If your wife's Melania, it's okay to have an excessive love for Melania. That's just my personal view because she is basically perfect.
It's possible he might still pick DeSantis, isn't it, as his running mate?
Possible. It seems unlikely, doesn't it? I mean, I think you'll go with Vivek at this point. Well, Vivek was certainly angling for it. He was like, I'm going to go and join you on stage in New Hampshire. And he was sort of saying that. So, but yeah, no, that is up for grabs. Yeah, who's it going to be? That is really important. I mean, Roger Stone had loads of ideas. He even put in Tulsi Gabbard. He had loads of ideas. And he had some other... He said you don't need to be someone too boring. But yeah, that's a great question. Who is going to be that role? And we don't.
I would have thought
that
from Trump's point of view, DeSantis is more attractive than Vivek because, to go back to your 48 laws of power, isn't there a risk as Trump kind of gets a little older and crazier, Vivek would kind of gain by contrast and could begin to eclipse Trump, whereas DeSantis isn't as charismatic or as kind of energetic as Vivek, and therefore would be less likely to kind of outshine the boss.
Good point. He says he's picked 6 days ago, but he won't say who. There's people making 8 predictions here. Kristi Noem is mentioned. Elsie Stefanik, she's one that was very impressive against Claudine Gay, wasn't she?
Yeah.
In that hearing. Tim Scott, Mike Pompeo, he could come back. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, I like her. Byron Donalds, no idea. Marjorie Taylor Greene, too dumb, too mental. Carrie Lake, very good. She's very strong. I like Carrie Lake. But will it be any of those? There was rumours of Tucker at one point, wasn't there?
Yes.
That would have been
Yes,
fun.
that would be. Or that would be.
What am I doing here? I'm a
That would
talk
be
show
fun,
host. I'm not a politician. I shouldn't be here, but I am because America's in trouble. Here's why.
America needs me.
Yeah. I don't think I don't think he'd be up for it. Probably interesting. It's probably be someone quite boring and predictable. What if it's Nikki Haley? That's what some people are saying. That would be a curveball. Seems unlikely though. DeSantis could be a curveball.
Yeah.
Maybe DeSantis kisses the ring and just says, "Yeah, look," and just does a groveling statement, and then Trump brings him on board and said, "He tried to go against me, but I've forgiven him. I've forgiven him. He's here." You know, he could do a lot of that. I forgave him. Should I forgive him? Yeah, he could do a lot of that, could he? Then DeSantis, just like traitor banter. But he is very big on loyalty, Trump. I'm not sure. But he has forgiven people like Ted Cruz. He went from like Lion Ted or whatever it was to sleazy sleazeball Ted Cruz to like totally endorsing him. So he can turn around. Bannon, he's been all over the place on. So it could happen. I'm sensing you maybe slightly over this, Toby, so I'm going to move on. But I'll never stop talking about Trump. So maybe the listener will welcome us moving on. We don't have much time, actually. We've got to do this quick story back over this side of the pond about Gary Lineker. So Gary Lineker has removed a social media post that called for Israel to be banned from international football. The former England star, now one of the highest profile presenters on the BBC, which we don't really need all this, retweeted a post by the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACBI, on X, formerly Twitter. So in the post, the PACB, PACB, I don't know how you say it, called for international public and official pressure on international sporting bodies, including football's governing body FIFA and the International Olympic Committee, to suspend Israel's membership and ban it from international tournaments and games. And they are affiliated with the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, BDS, who have called for the boycott until Israel ends its grave violations of international law, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, Lineker's claim is he thought it was just news that Israel had been banned rather than a campaign to ban them. That's his claim, basically pleading stupidity, which is quite a good angle if you're Gary Lineker. And by the way, this was also retweeted favorably, reposted by the Quds News Network, who said renowned English broadcaster calls for Israel to be banned from international football. And the Quds News Network is a Palestinian youth news agency formed in 2011, which is affiliated or was affiliated in the past with Hamas. So very, very bad. You're being praised by a Hamas affiliated group for your lame retweet. And then a further wrinkle is whether it jeopardizes Lineker's role in the Euros, because weirdly, Israel are in the Euros, and does it destroy his impartiality? Because he's saying, well, the team shouldn't even be in this, so how can he comment on it for the BBC? So, Toby, what do you think?
Well, I'm now going to make the case for the defence of Gary Lineker, and it's Gary Lineker's defence, in fact, which is if you look at the tweet he retweeted from PACB. The tweet refers to the Palestinian Football Association. And it does sound like PACB is putting out a news story. So the tweet said, the Palestinian Football Association calls on IOC Media and FIFA.com and all regional and international sports bodies to take an urgent stance on Israel's grave violations of human rights and subject it to legally accountable measures. So if you didn't know that PACB is an activist, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli organization, although to be fair, you'd have to be pretty stupid not to realize that, because it is the account is PACB-BDS movement. But nevertheless, Lineker's defense is, I just thought I was retweeting a news story. I didn't realize that the tweet I was retweeting had been tweeted by a pro-Palestinian activist organization, and therefore it would look as though I was endorsing kicking Israel out of the Euros by retweeting it. I simply thought I was retweeting a impartially reported news story by a news organization. And I've now deleted the tweet. Now I realize my error. So, I mean, it's interesting that he's deleted it. I think even the BBC, even, Tim Davie, I think, balked at this and said, Gary, you've got to delete this. We can't defend this. You've gone right up to the edge on numerous occasions up until now. You've actually crossed the line now, and you're going to have to delete this one, or we're going to have to get rid of you, or you're not going to be part of our Euro coverage. So presumably with a gun to his head, he's deleted it, and this is his excuse.
Yeah, well, one BBC insider described it as typical Gary, while another said this is a worse case than usual. This is bad even by Gary's low standards. Do you believe him, though?
Yeah.
Case for defense aside, do you believe Gary?
No, I don't think I do. I think he probably, I said I'd start out by defending him, not doing a great job. I think he probably knew exactly what he was doing and didn't realise that this would be as frowned upon as it has been, or as big a story as it has been. And so has now, for self-preservation reasons, deleted it and come up with this cock and bull story about not realising it was an activist organisation that he was retweeting. I mean, we know where he stands on the Israel-Palestine conflict, so it's completely in keeping with other positions he's taken, isn't it?
That's the key. It's irrelevant because let's say I do believe it. It's possible. Yeah, he didn't realize that particular tweet was that. I think that's possible because that's possible just from would you want to get yourself in trouble? It's possible for pure self-preservation reasons. I do believe he cares about self-preservation to some extent. So it's possible he didn't know that tweet or that X post was that bad and it was just news because he is thick. But that's his view anyway, as you say. So that would be his view anyway. So it doesn't matter really. It's academic because we saw he didn't post anything about October 7th. He maintains he did. I've seen him replying to people. I think he's blocked me now. But I've seen him replying to people saying he did, but he didn't. He didn't post anything about it. Whereas he does post anything else about the terrible things that Israel are doing and Suella Braverman's like a Nazi, blah blah. We all know these things. We all know where he stands. It's just shocking that people have got that far left, but it's not that shocking because I know all these people in the kind of extended blob professional class, they who think like Lineker. It's just become de rigueur for them to have a now extremely far left. Well, you could call it far left, but whatever you want to call it, extremely anti-Israel position that borders on pro-terrorism. So yeah, that's just the stance now. So there we are. And you wanted to briefly mention as well that Cleverly has officially prescribed Hizb al-Tahrir as a terrorist organization.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, about time. And we were a bit of an outlier amongst European countries for not banning them. And this will have an impact, I think, on the weekly pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which don't seem to have abated much since the, New Year. And there was a big one on Saturday, supposedly 200,000 people, and lots of really offensive placards being waved about and slogans being chanted. But Hizb al-Tahrir organised some of these protests in the past, and they've always had a role in organising the pro-Palestinian protests on Saturdays. So this will be interesting. Will the police actually arrest, people who are openly now members of what is a prescribed terrorist organisation now? Will they arrest people for expressing support for Hizb al-Tahrir, given that they're now a prescribed terrorist organisation? I don't suppose it'll make much difference from that point of view, but at least Cleverly has finally done something. So, or the government seems to be taking some action, which is good to see.
Yeah, and there's only one slightly strange response to it. Well, strange to me because I'm not an expert, from Majid Nawaz, who said, as all in the counterterrorism field know, this initiative is inaccurate, counterproductive, and politically driven. Hizb al-Tahrir is, or he says it slightly differently, is a revolutionary Islamist, not jihadist terrorist organization. Mixing classifications in this way only serves to undermine legitimate work. He said, so it's terrorism to call for armies of Muslim-majority governments to fight Israel, but it's not terrorism for our armed forces to bomb Yemen for Israel. The UK government is completely losing its way on counter-terror policy to placate Netanyahu-wing Zionists. It's a farce. And he says, as you'd know if you'd bothered to ask me, they called for the armies of Muslim-majority countries to fight a jihad, physical struggle. They didn't call for terrorist acts. I'm only a bloody phone call away. Now, to me, as an outsider to this issue a little bit, that seemed a bit academic, but to Majid, apparently that's a very important distinction.
Yeah. And of course, Majid was arrested and imprisoned in Egypt for being a member of a then prohibited, supposedly terrorist organisation, wasn't he, for a time? So you can see why he'd be sensitive about this issue.
He obviously thinks
but
it's not
certainly,
effective and doesn't work to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's always a good argument against censorship of any kind. But looking at the the speakers on Hizb al-Tahrir's platforms at some of the demonstrations over the past 100 days and more, they don't just seem to be calling for revolutions in Islamic countries. They seem to be calling for intifada from here to Gaza, and for the destruction of the state of Israel. Maybe they're expressing it slightly differently, but it feels to me that they've crossed the line, and should now be added to the list of prescribed terrorist organizations.
Yeah, well, I'm fine with it. Toby, do you want to? Those are our main stories for the day. Do you want to do our advert?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is an advert from the Stack Assistant. Bitcoin is an index for money laundering, claimed Larry Fink in 2018. As the CEO of BlackRock, with over $10 trillion worth of squeaky clean assets under management, he would know. But now that BlackRock has launched a Bitcoin ETF, Fink more accurately says that Bitcoin is a fight to quality and will protect against monetary debasement. In 2017, the Credit Suisse CEO described Bitcoin as the very definition of a bubble, but it was his bank that imploded, while Bitcoin grows ever stronger. And now the Bitcoin Trojan horse is being pulled into the sclerotic heart of the decaying fiat money citadel by the very banksters it will render obsolete. In the first 2 days of trading, the Bitcoin ETFs swallowed up 23,000 Bitcoin. At that rate, all the Bitcoin for sale on exchanges will be exhausted in under 4 months. And before then, the 4-yearly Bitcoin halving will occur, when the issuance rate of the remaining Bitcoin is halved. What happens when increasing demand meets unalterably inelastic supply? We're about to find out. At the Stack Assistant, we offer free advice to help you stack your first sats, as the subunits of Bitcoin are called, and securing your stack into self-custody. Email the Stack Assistant on thestackassistant@pm.me. That's the Stack Assistant, all one word, at pm.me.
All right, thanks to the Stack Assistant. And we have no Will this week, so let's go and do everyone's favourite section, which is Peak Woke. So, Toby, I don't know if you have any pressing Peak Wokes this week, but I've got quite a few. One good one that we did on Headliners on GB News, I have in front of me here, which is as alarming report, this is the Daily Mail, reveals women and girls are quitting sports over fears they will be injured. It's revealed a 16-stone trans woman dislocated the shoulder of a female judo rival. Did you hear this? I mean, this is just unbelievable. What this was basically an account of various women just talking about horrific things that have happened to them as a result of men being in combat sports with women. I mean, a 16-stone trans woman broke a woman's finger and dislocated the shoulder of another during a judo tournament. And I recounted doing judo as a young child in primary school and being about 8 or 10 or something, and being up against boys and doing quite well in the judo because I was reasonably strong. And everyone was about the same size, and it was quite good at judo. But then they put me up against a girl, and I was like, I don't want to fight a girl. It was really weird. I was like, why are you putting me up against a girl? So I just didn't attack the whole fact she would try and trip me. I just blocked the trips and just stood still basically. Was never going to be taken down by a girl, but was never going to fight a girl. Why did I know as a young child that you don't physically fight girls, but these 16-stone men don't know?
Yeah, it's shocking, and you would hope that more and more sporting associations would prohibit biological males from competing against biological females, but it doesn't seem to be happening nearly fast enough.
All right. Do you have any? I've got a couple more, but do you want to go?
Yeah. So the Maritime Museum has created this is a museum supposedly celebrating Britain's national maritime its maritime history, and there is a bust of Nelson in the museum, but they've created this kind of they've created this completely fictional goddess called the sea deity. So an artist has created this bust of a entirely fictional deity, and she's described in the label below her bust as a godlike protector of all migrants making dangerous sea crossings. And if you listen on the headphones that you can buy when you go in the museum to hear a kind of commentary as you walk around, she says some pretty disparaging things about Nelson. So pretty shocking. But I guess, perhaps not that surprising that a national museum, presumably funded by the government, is denigrating one of our most celebrated military heroes. And to do that, they've invented this entirely fictional deity created by an artist a couple of years ago. She's apparently genderless, amongst other things, and remonstrates with Nelson in this imaginary dialogue that the museum's curators have created. Nelson says, "Is there anything more glorious than fighting for your country? England expects it." And the fictional goddess replies, "Listen to me. You're not the only ones who have shown bravery and resilience at sea. Many people are forced to make treacherous journeys escaping war. As a protector of migrants, I have no need for your fancy medals and uniform. My armour and life jacket protect people from harm. I carry essential supplies and the precious memories and dreams of every person I protect. What can be more important than that?"
Wow. Look,
Pretty incredible.
obviously it's sad that another 5 migrants died the other day and these terrible crossings, but that sounds absolutely awful. That does sound absolutely peak woke. I can't top it, but I'm going to give you one more from
Okay.
an end. Oh,
Yeah, go on.
yeah. End Wokeness did an X post about this, and a few people have picked up on this. And he says Marvel just got its first female Native American deaf amputee superhero. No, this is not satire, and this is Echo. And she does indeed have a leg missing and has an artificial leg and is a Native American and deaf. And now, some people pointed out Echo has been around since the late 90s, which was pretty politically correct at the time anyway. But so, okay, it's not new, but this is a new series, I guess, although she has appeared in Hawkeye and things like that before. I've done some research on it. But nonetheless, that is about as woke as it gets. And it looks like she has a new series. So that's about as woke as it gets for a superhero, isn't it? Amputee, Native American, has to rediscover her Native American roots while having one leg and being deaf.
Yes, that's pretty peak woke. And I note in passing that Marvel had its worst ever year at the box office in 2023, and its latest offering, The Marvels, has completely tanked. And it really does seem to be a case of get woke, go broke for Marvel, which seems to have been absorbed by the Disney kind of intersectional Death Star, and just become a vehicle for woke propaganda, which surprisingly there isn't that much appetite for amongst the American public. But yeah, it's sad but inevitable. I think that Marvel's just going to now collapse.
Well, in a change to the usual, Toby's got to go soon. I've actually got to go soon, but do you have any more, Toby?
I was just going to mention this. So that the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Military Journal, has devoted an entire issue to what a irredeemably racist country Canada is. In a series of 13 essays, the introduction talks about the feminist intersectional trauma-informed approach to reimagining and transforming CAF culture. So the Canadian Armed Forces are apparently being transformed by kind of woke commissars. I think seemingly across the Anglosphere, the armed forces have been completely captured by kind of the wokesters. They've been very susceptible to the woke religion. You can understand it happening in universities, museums, the arts, even the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but you would have thought the armed forces would hold out and have some antibodies. But actually, they proved particularly vulnerable to it. And of course, that has coincided, not coincidentally, with a recruitment crisis in the armed forces. So I saw the story, if you saw the story this week, but we can't send an aircraft carrier to the Red Sea because the Royal Navy is understaffed. And looks as though the Royal Marines may have to be disbanded because not enough people want to be Royal Marines. And I imagine it's not, one of the reasons is that kind of, ordinary white young men who were considering careers in regiments like the Royal Marines think, well, what's the point in applying? I haven't got a chance of getting in. I'm not gay. I'm not trans. I'm not a woman. I don't have a limb missing. What hope do I have? It's one of the most alarming symptoms of the kind of wokeification of public services, the public sector, governments, is the wokeification of the armed forces, which is, as we face an increasingly turbulent world in which we may yet be plunged into war at any moment, our armed forces have never been less capable of defending us. So, another reason for alarm.
They've also systematically undermined any kind of patriotism and national pride. So that's one reason. And as for the wokeness, I suppose they are by nature quite authoritarian people and quite conformist. So perhaps that's why the army's gone along with wokeness. Just a theory there. But okay, well that is peak woke. And since I'm running out of time, Toby, do we have a message for our listeners, because we're trying out our new platform now. We're not trying it out. We're launching our new platform, and so anyone who's listening now will be able to get an extended, longer bit of content where we're going to start doing questions and all sorts. But Toby, do you want to explain it to the listener/viewer?
Yes. So we have now launched basedmedia.org, mine and Nick's new podcasting and events business. And that means that we'll be including some additional premium content at the end of this particular episode. We're going to be doing, in the premium section, a review of the reviews, and we're also going to be answering questions that have been sent to us by listeners. But if you want to hear the final 15 minutes of the Weekly Sceptic, you're going to have to go to basemedia.org and become a premium subscriber. It's very cheap. You can become a premium subscriber for as little as £5 a month. If you pay a little bit more, you get other perks. Go to the website, check it out, see what you get for your money. But for as little as £5 a month, you can become a premium subscriber, and then you can listen to or watch the remainder of this podcast.
Yes, and there's going to be far more than 15 minutes on other episodes in the future. We were just running late today because of tech issues, and it's a new thing. But there's going to be loads of extra content and Zoom calls with me and Toby, meals, all kinds of things. So yeah, it's a whole cornucopia of features that are coming up. So check out basemedia.org. That's correct, isn't it? Yes,
that is correct.
That is correct. And another very solidly length episode for you there, even without Will. So still great value from the Weekly Sceptic, however you're listening. So that is pretty much it. Until next week, stay skeptical.
Stay skeptical.